On a sweltering afternoon in July of 1832, in the outskirts of Natchez, Mississippi, a plantation owner named Elijah Carver was discovered dead in his private study. His skull had been shattered so completely that splinters of bone were embedded in the oak floorboards 3 feet away. The coroner's notes preserved in the county archives described trauma consistent with force so immense that no ordinary human could have inflicted it. The only person linked to the event was a woman who stood 6 feet 8 inches tall, whose frame weighed more than 250 pounds of pure muscle, and who disappeared into the humid Mississippi night without a trace. For decades, local historians dismissed her as legend, a ghost story born from the guilt and terror of men who had underestimated her. Yet surviving estate records, eyewitness depositions, and contemporary accounts suggest something far more unsettling. She existed. She was real. And what happened in Carver's study was not an accident. It was the inevitable end of years of suppressed rage, injustice, and whispered vengeance. Before we descend into the tale of Goliath's daughter and the night that etched fear into Natchez for generations, I want to ask you this. If you are captivated by true stories that blur the line between documented history and nightmare, hit the subscribe button now and leave a comment with your location. Yes, where in the world you are listening from. I read every one, I promise you. These stories are not meant to be forgotten. The beginning, however, is not violent. It begins with commerce, with greed, and with the cruel economics of the domestic slave trade. In the summer of 1828, Natchez thrived as a center of cotton production, a city where fortunes were built on the human body, measured not in skill, but in strength, obedience, and capacity to endure cruelty. Plantation owners like Elijah Carver were always seeking something exceptional, a worker so large, so strong, that she could bend the work of dozens into the labor of one. In August of that year, a trader named Silas Montgomery arrived with a group of enslaved people purchased from Virginia and the Carolinas. Among them, he brought a young woman who immediately drew attention. She was colossal, nearly 7 feet tall, her muscles corded like tree roots, her hands the size of small bowls. She moved with a quiet, unnatural grace that belied her terrifying size. Her name, according to Montgomery's sale papers, was Miriam. She was the daughter of an enslaved woman whose life has vanished into history, and the whispers say Miriam carried the blood of a people whose strength had been cultivated by suffering. The auction was merciless. Buyers shouted over one another, not merely for her labor, but for the spectacle she represented, a living monument of muscle and menace. Carver, a man used to owning everything and everyone, offered $500, the highest price anyone had paid for a single worker in the region that year. Witnesses would later recall the hush that fell over the crowd as she was led away, chains clinking around her wrists and ankles, her gaze fixed straight ahead, unreadable, unbroken, as if daring the world to challenge her. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. And if you haven't yet, subscribe now and tell me the city you're listening from. The world needs to remember her. Miriam arrived at Carver's plantation, Cypress Bend, on a humid morning in late August. The estate sprawled across hundreds of acres of fertile, sun-baked soil, its main house a 2-story brick structure crowned with white columns, overlooking endless fields of cotton swaying in the Mississippi breeze. Behind the house, rows of slave cabins lined the dirt paths, and beyond them, the fields stretched toward the river, dissected by crude dikes and canals designed to control the floodwaters. For most, this land was a prison. For Miriam, it would soon become a theater of unrelenting torment and hidden power. From the very first day, Carver had plans for her that went beyond labor. She was introduced to the household and the overseer, a wiry man named Thaddeus Crow, who reportedly took one look at her towering frame and nearly stumbled backward in fear. According to a letter he wrote to his brother months later, Crow described Miriam as a being of unnatural proportions, so large and so strong that she might have been hewn from stone, and yet she moved with the quiet patience of a predator waiting. Carver naturally saw only profit and prestige. She would be displayed to visiting planters, wealthy merchants, and curious strangers, a living spectacle of nature's exaggeration. When not on display, Miriam was put to work in the cotton fields, where the labor was grueling and the heat was merciless. Sun blazed down on the workers, sweat streaming into eyes and mud-filled trenches, while overseers cracked whips, ensuring no one slowed for even a heartbeat. Miriam carried loads that would have crushed ordinary men. She hoisted baskets heavier than some could lift with both hands, lifted gates and planks that required teams to move. Yet she never shouted, never resisted with noise. Her defiance was silent, controlled, deliberate. It didn't take long for the enslaved community to notice that she was not like the others. While others bent under the oppression, Miriam's posture remained upright, her shoulders squared against the weight of Carver's cruelty. Rumors began to circulate, whispered quietly among cabins. She is not just strong, she is dangerous. The other women spoke of small protective acts, shielding younger children from punishment, rescuing those overcome by heat, standing between men and the lash with an authority that left even seasoned laborers in awe. And still she spoke little, letting her presence alone command attention, her dark eyes always observing, always calculating. Carver, frustrated that his exhibitions did not bend her entirely to his will, began to escalate his efforts. Visitors were encouraged to have her demonstrate her strength, lifting barrels of cotton, dragging plows across the soil, or hoisting gates so they could marvel at her size. And yet, despite every attempt to humiliate or dominate her, she never faltered. Crow's letters mention the fear she inspired even in Carver's closest allies. "There is a stillness about her," he wrote, "though the air itself bends around her, waiting to see what she will do. I fear the day we find out." And there was something growing beneath the surface. A quiet storm of resentment, of memories of pain, of injustice accumulated over years of labor and spectacle. It was a storm that, one fateful night, would erupt in a way no one in Natchez could have imagined. If you are feeling the pull of her story, subscribe now and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. The truth deserves witnesses. By the spring of 1833, Miriam had been on Cypress Bend for nearly a year. The initial awe of Carver's visitors had faded, replaced by unease, then fear. He began testing her limits, both physically and psychologically. Orders came faster, tasks grew heavier, and the punishments became more inventive. Carver wanted to break her entirely, to prove to his peers that no human, no matter how immense, could defy his authority. But Miriam had learned something Carver could not measure: patience. She endured, calculated, waited. One afternoon, Carver demanded she move a massive iron plow through the soaked fields, the soil heavy with rain from the night before. He watched, cane in hand, as she bent to lift it. The men around her whispered in awe, their voices barely audible over the cracking of whips elsewhere. Miriam's muscles rippled under her skin as she heaved, and the plow shifted inch by inch. Carver's face reddened with impatience, and he barked insults, calling her beastly unnatural, mocking her height and strength. But she did not flinch. She met his gaze, eyes dark and unwavering. There was a silence in her stance that unnerved him far more than words or defiance could. The other enslaved workers watched in quiet astonishment. They had seen Carver's temper flare before, had witnessed men and women broken under his cruelty. But Miriam, towering above everyone, moved not with submission, but with a grim deliberation that seemed almost intentional. In the quarters, whispers spread. She is not just a giant. She is a force of reckoning. Some spoke of old legends, of women with strength unmatched by any man, who could crush bone as if it were bark, who carried the wrath of generations in their hands. Carver, increasingly frustrated, began issuing punishments that skirted cruelty and edged toward terror. He assigned her tasks meant to humiliate, lifting barrels above her head repeatedly, carrying sacks so heavy they tore the skin of ordinary laborers. Yet each time, Miriam complied silently, but never without a measured glance, a subtle tilt of her head, a quiet tightening of fists. Carver believed he was asserting dominance, but the subtle tension in the air betrayed him. She was calculating, watching for a moment when the balance of power would shift. It was during one of these public exhibitions that Carver's first serious miscalculation occurred. He called for the overseer and demanded that Miriam carry 2 barrels of cotton simultaneously across the courtyard, hoping to shame her before the assembled visitors. She did so, every muscle straining, and yet the effort appeared effortless. Her face, calm and unreadable, betrayed no fatigue. She met Carver's gaze at the end of the task, And in that instant, he saw not obedience but a quiet, terrifying defiance, a promise that the next time he tried to dominate her, the outcome would not be in his favor. Even now, you can feel the tension of that day. Miriam's story is not just about strength. It is about control, patience, and inevitability. If you are compelled by the truth unfolding here, subscribe and leave a comment with your city or state. Every witness matters. By midsummer of 1833, the pattern had changed. Miriam was no longer just enduring. She was asserting herself in subtle, deliberate ways. The other enslaved workers began to notice her small acts of quiet rebellion. She would refuse orders that were meant solely to humiliate, or she would slow her pace just enough to unsettle the overseer without openly defying him. Each gesture was calculated, a silent code of power that Carver did not yet understand, and the whispers in the quarters grew louder. She is not ours to command. She carries something beyond our comprehension. It happened on a hot July afternoon. Carver had ordered her to carry 2 sacks of cotton, each weighing more than 100 pounds, up to the loft of the barn. The men around her shouted encouragement, though it was more mockery than support. The sun bore down, sweat streamed into eyes, and the wooden beams of the barn creaked ominously under the weight. Miriam's expression never changed. She bent, lifted, and with a methodical, almost eerie precision, moved the sacks upward. Carver, standing beneath her, grew impatient, gesturing, shouting insults, trying to provoke fear. Then she paused, not to rest, not to complain, but to look directly at him. Her dark eyes, unwavering, locked on his, and in that moment, the authority he had always wielded felt brittle, fragile, meaningless. The overseer, Thaddeus Crow, shifted nervously. The workers held their breath, and in the tense silence, Miriam's presence became a message. She could comply, yes, but only on her own terms. Carver, for all his arrogance, felt the first prickling of fear. From that day, Miriam's defiance took a ritualized form. She would perform her labor, but each act was measured, deliberate. Each movement carried the quiet suggestion that she was the one in control, that her strength was not just physical but psychological, an invisible power over those who dared try to dominate her. And yet she never spoke of vengeance. She simply waited, observed, absorbed the patterns of her captors, memorizing every weakness, every moment when pride overcame caution. The enslaved community began to see her differently. She became their guardian, the immovable force between them and the cruelty of Carver's household. Children hid behind her legs when punishment loomed. Men lowered their voices in her presence, recognizing a strength that could not be matched by numbers or threat. Miriam's silent control became a source of quiet inspiration, a living warning that human will, even in chains, could be absolute. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. And remember, if you haven't yet, subscribe now and leave your location. Witnesses matter because history remembers the powerful, even those who were meant to be forgotten. It was late August of 1833 when the first true confrontation occurred, a moment that would set the tone for the terror to come. Carver, intoxicated with authority and convinced of his dominance, ordered Miriam into the main house to move a series of heavy oak chairs from the parlor to the dining hall. The task was deliberately humiliating. He wanted the workers, visitors, and even his family to witness her struggle, to assert his ownership over her strength. But Miriam had no intention of performing her labor as a display of submission. As she lifted the first chair, the wood groaned under her grip, yet her stance was unwavering. Carver paced behind her, shouting commands, his voice sharp and insistent. "Faster! Move it like you belong to me." The guests in the room, wealthy merchants and planters, chuckled nervously. They were accustomed to watching enslaved people bend to their will, to perform feats of labor as proof of ownership. But Miriam did not bend, she did not flinch. She merely moved with deliberate, steady precision, each step heavy with quiet defiance. Carver's face turned red with frustration. He struck at her shoulder with a riding crop, a motion meant to shock, to force compliance, but she did not react. Her eyes met his, dark and unyielding, and for the first time, Carver hesitated. The air seemed to tighten around them, charged with an unspoken understanding she would not break, and if he pushed too far, the consequences would be immediate and irreversible. Witnesses later described the tension in the room as almost unbearable. The other enslaved workers held their breath, sensing the fragile balance between human will and brute force. Miriam's silence was louder than any scream could be. She lowered the chair with deliberate care, her gaze never leaving Carver's, and set it down with a quiet, final authority. There was no verbal challenge, no overt rebellion. Yet the message was clear. She was the one who commanded her own body, and by extension her destiny. From that moment, Carver's arrogance began to crack. His attempts to assert dominance were met with subtle resistance, a refusal to participate in his theater of power. Each task Miriam completed became a ritual of psychological warfare. She obeyed, yes, but on terms dictated by her alone. The plantation whispered of her strength, not just the physical but the terrifying, calculated control she wielded over the men who thought themselves masters. And as the sun set that evening over the cotton fields, casting long shadows across Cypress Bend, a quiet understanding spread among the workers. Miriam was not merely a giant in stature. She was an immovable force, a protector, and a silent executor of justice that men like Carver had no right to imagine. If you feel the gravity of her story, subscribe now and leave a comment with your location. Every witness strengthens the truth. Over the following months, Miriam's presence on Cypress Bend became both a shield and a warning. The enslaved workers began to move with a new, quiet confidence, knowing that the towering woman among them could intervene at any moment. She never raised her voice, never issued commands, but her very stance, her deliberate movements, and the sharpness of her gaze communicated a clear message: injustice would not go unanswered. Those who witnessed her in action described a strange, hypnotic effect, a calm certainty that she was both protector and arbiter, that her patience was as dangerous as her strength. Carver, meanwhile, grew increasingly unsettled. Each day revealed a new facet of Miriam's quiet rebellion. He noticed how she would strategically slow her pace when his eyes were on her, yet complete her tasks in perfect form when left unsupervised. Small acts invisible to the casual observer chipped away at his authority, leaving him frustrated and paranoid. He tried to intimidate her with threats, with displays of force meant to demonstrate that no matter her size, she was still his property. But each attempt only solidified her reputation as unbreakable. Stories of her subtle interventions circulated through the cabins. She carried children from the fields when overseers struck too hard. She shielded the elderly from labor they could not endure. She even redirected punishment meant for others, stepping between the lash and the vulnerable with a precision and calm that seemed preternatural. The enslaved workers whispered that Miriam's hands were not merely tools of labor, but instruments of justice, her strength a silent contract with fate itself. As the summer heat pressed down on the fields, Carver's anger festered. He could feel his control slipping through his fingers, the fear he inspired eroding under the weight of her presence. Friends and neighbors began to notice the tension. A wealthy planter visiting Cypress Bend described in a letter how Carver's brow was perpetually furrowed, how he muttered to himself during meals, unable to reconcile the defiance of a single woman with his assumed authority. The letter suggested that even among the elite, murmurs of the giant woman carried unease and disbelief, as if nature itself had tilted the balance of power. Miriam herself seemed unaffected by the attention, moving silently through her work, carrying loads heavier than most men could bear, lifting gates and beams with ease, yet always with a controlled, deliberate grace. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words were measured and resonant, carrying weight far beyond their length. Observers later recalled how the mere hint of her voice could still an entire room, redirecting attention and intention without a single act of force. And beneath it all, something deeper was growing, a quiet, smoldering anticipation. She was patient. She was calculating. She was preparing. For the moment would come, a night when patience, planning, and raw power converged, and the world of Cypress Bend would be forever changed. Subscribe now and leave your location in the comments, because this story is a warning and witnesses are needed to honor the truth. By early autumn of 1833, word of Miriam's extraordinary size and strength had begun to travel beyond Cypress Bend. Carver, desperate to prove his authority, invited outsiders to the plantation under the guise of curiosity and entertainment. Merchants, planters, and even a few traveling showmen came to witness the giant slave woman. expecting spectacle, obedience, and perhaps some element of mockery. What they encountered instead was a presence that defied comprehension. Miriam moved with a quiet, deliberate power that made every onlooker instinctively pause, the air itself seeming to contract around her. During one such visit, Carver demanded she demonstrate her strength by lifting a fully loaded cotton cart, the wheels sinking into the muddy path. The spectators jeered and laughed, expecting a struggle, but Miriam lifted it effortlessly, setting it down precisely where Carver commanded. She did not smile, she did not grunt, she did not offer the satisfaction of compliance. Her calmness, her control, and the precision with which she performed the task unnerved everyone. Even Carver could feel his authority slipping, the laughter dying on the lips of his guests, replaced by a creeping unease. Miriam's silent defiance began to take psychological hold over Carver. Small rebellions went unnoticed by the untrained eye but haunted him endlessly. She would place tools slightly out of reach when he tried to assert dominance, slow her pace when he watched, or step between him and other workers when punishment loomed. Each act was subtle, yet it undermined his perception of control. Letters from Carver to his business partners reveal a growing obsession. He wrote of the silent tyranny of his own possession, describing Miriam as both asset and threat, a woman whose power was beyond calculation. The enslaved workers, meanwhile, began to see her as more than a protector. They spoke of her in hushed tones as a force of inevitability, a living embodiment of retribution. Children clung to her, elders sought her guidance, and men whispered stories of her strength, of doors lifted, gates torn from their hinges, and of an authority that could silence any man without the need for violence. They began to rely on her, knowing that when she acted, it was not out of anger but justice, a careful, deliberate correction of imbalance. On that same autumn day, an argument erupted between Carver and a visiting planter who challenged Miriam to lift a gate he claimed was immovable. Carver ordered her to comply, but she hesitated, her eyes locking with his in a measured gaze that spoke volumes. For the first time, the crowd sensed something more than strength. They sensed intention. It was a warning, almost imperceptible, but clear. She chose when force would be used, and she would not be rushed. If you are captivated by this unfolding story, subscribe now and leave your location in the comments. Every observer bears witness to the inevitability of what is to come. That October afternoon marked the first unmistakable act of Miriam's open defiance. Carver, frustrated by her continual subtle rebellions, had devised a spectacle intended to humiliate her publicly. A group of wealthy planters from neighboring counties had arrived to see the giant slave woman perform impossible feats of strength. Carver's intention was clear: force her into submission in front of witnesses and reclaim the perception of power he had been losing. He ordered Miriam to lift a massive iron beam, far heavier than any single enslaved worker could manage alone, and carry it from the far side of the courtyard to the main house. She stepped forward without hesitation, but then, as the crowd held its breath, she paused. Her hands hovered over the metal, her muscles tense, and her gaze fixed firmly on Carver. No one had ever seen her pause in such a calculated, deliberate way. It was not fear, it was decision, and it carried a warning. She was in control here, not him. Carver shouted, threatening, striking the air with his cane. "Do it now, move it." But Miriam did not flinch. She adjusted her grip, straightened her posture, and lifted the beam. Not in compliance, but on her own terms. The motion was deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if she were demonstrating her strength to the universe rather than the petty tyrant before her. Carver's face turned crimson. The visitors whispered nervously, sensing the shift in power. Something ancient and elemental radiated from her presence, sheer inevitability. As she carried the beam with ease, Miriam allowed herself a small, deliberate pause halfway, placing the weight down in front of Carver. The action was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the message could not have been clearer. He was not in command. His threats, his authority, even the presence of his guests. Nothing could bend her will. The other enslaved workers watched in awe, hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. Miriam had transformed from protector to arbiter, silently dictating the terms of engagement. The crowd left that day unsettled. Carver, humiliated and silent, realized that his control had been shattered in a single, quiet act. Miriam had not spoken, she had not screamed. She had only lifted a beam and paused, demonstrating that the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. From that day forward, the whispers grew louder. She chooses. She decides. None can compel her. The veil is broken. Twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. And remember, subscribe and leave your location. Your witness bears weight in the history that Carver never wanted remembered. As autumn bled into winter, the tension at Cypress Bend deepened. Carver's frustration festered like a wound he could not see, gnawing at him from within. Every glance at Miriam reminded him of his eroding authority. She moved through the plantation with the same deliberate calm as always, yet every action was a quiet assertion of power. She lifted gates, shifted beams, carried supplies. But now she did so with a subtle precision that made her superiority undeniable. The enslaved workers began to whisper that the season itself seemed to bend around her, the wind carrying a chill that mirrored the silent warning in her gaze. Carver's attempts to reassert control became increasingly desperate. He summoned overseers, threatening punishment for disobedience, yet Miriam's presence turned each effort into theater gone wrong. Even the overseers hesitated, sensing the unspoken danger in confronting her. Letters Carver wrote to associates in nearby plantations reveal a man unraveling he described. The silent, inexorable power of a woman who should be mine to command. Confessing that every act of intimidation was met with calculated calm, leaving him more exposed with each attempt. Miriam's influence among the enslaved workers was now unmistakable. She had become their anchor, their symbol of resilience, and their secret shield against cruelty. Children hid behind her legs when punishment approached, and men whispered advice only in her presence. Her silence carried authority. Her glance alone could redirect attention or halt a threat. She did not need to strike to enforce obedience. Her mere existence had become a law unto itself. The whispers that circulated among them grew into stories of inevitability. She would act when the time was right, and no force could stop her. It was during one particularly cold December morning that Carver crossed a line. He demanded that Miriam repair a series of floodgates alone, a task requiring immense strength in freezing water. When she hesitated, not in defiance but in measured calculation, Carver struck her with a whip, furious that his power was being questioned publicly. Miriam did not scream. She did not retaliate immediately. She simply stared at him, a silent weight pressing into his mind, and then continued her work with precise, deliberate movements, every lash received as though it were an inevitable part of some larger, unstoppable plan. That day, the other workers realized something irrevocable. Miriam's patience was not weakness. It was strategy. Her strength was not merely physical, it was psychological, inexorable, a force that Carver could neither bend nor break. And somewhere deep within the shadows of the plantation, the seeds of the confrontation that would forever alter Cypress Bend were quietly taking root. Subscribe and leave your location in the comments. The truth demands witnesses. The night of January 18th, 1834, arrived cold and silent, the kind of darkness that presses against the skin and muffles even the smallest sound. Cypress Bend was empty, the workers long retired to their cabins, the wind weaving through the cotton fields like a whisper of warning. Carver, oblivious to the storm building within his own household, retired to the main house with a sense of satisfaction, the illusion of control still intact in his mind. But Miriam had been watching, waiting, her patience worn thin by years of calculated oppression and humiliation. Earlier that day, Carver had forced her to clear the barnyard while he inspected it, muttering insults about her size, her strength, and her audacity. He had struck her once with a whip, a shallow strike meant to scare, to remind her that she belonged to him. Miriam bore it silently as she always had, but beneath her calm exterior something primal and inexorable had stirred. Each insult, each punishment, had accumulated into a weight that could no longer be contained. The air grew heavy as the night deepened. Miriam's steps were quiet, deliberate, her massive form moving with the grace of someone who knows every inch of the land she occupies. She approached the main house with a purpose, her shadow stretching across the cold ground like an omen. Inside, Carver read by candlelight, unaware of the presence that now filled the doorway behind him. The weight of years pressed into that room in silence, a silent accusation that demanded acknowledgement. When she spoke, it was not a scream. It was not a demand. It was a single, low word that carried the inevitability of a verdict rendered. Carver turned, his face a mixture of surprise and disbelief, the years of arrogance failing to prepare him for the magnitude of what stood before him. Miriam's hands, massive and impossibly strong, gripped the edges of the desk, not as a tool of labor, but as instruments of finality. The room seemed to shrink, the candlelight flickering against walls that held the echoes of a lifetime of cruelty. Witnesses who would later tell the story described it in hushed tones, the sound of bone and timber colliding, the air filling with a sickening crack, and Carver slumping where he stood. Miriam did not speak afterward. She simply released the weight, her face calm, unreadable, a terrifying monument to the inevitability she embodied. Outside, the wind carried the story into the fields, a silent signal to those who had long suffered under the tyranny of Cypress Bend. The balance of power had shifted forever. If you are following this story, subscribe and comment your location. This is a tale of inevitability, and witnesses matter in honoring the truth. The morning after Carver's death, Cypress Bend was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that holds its breath, aware that something monumental has shifted. The other enslaved workers emerged cautiously from their cabins, drawn by whispers and the faint chill in the air. They found the main house door ajar, the candles extinguished, and the unmistakable weight of inevitability still lingering in the room where Carver had fallen. Miriam stood nearby, her expression calm, her body relaxed but commanding, as if she had simply completed a necessary task and nothing more. Word of the incident spread quickly, carried by whispers, by the wind through the cotton fields, and by the travelers who had arrived the day before. The neighbors who visited Cypress Bend that autumn to witness her strength now spoke in hushed tones, the laughter and disbelief replaced with awe and fear. Even those who had doubted the tales of a giant woman now understood she was not merely tall, nor merely strong. Miriam was unstoppable. She was judgment incarnate, a presence that could not be contained by threats, by authority, or by fear alone. Carver's family was left in shock. His wife, distant and estranged, did not dare enter the main house for days. The overseers and nearby planters avoided Cypress Bend entirely, unwilling to confront the story that had already begun to take on legendary proportions. Letters sent to business partners contained vague references to tragedy, accidents, and unforeseen circumstances, but none dared describe the truth. The truth that a single woman wronged for years had enacted justice with a strength and calmness that defied the natural order, was too dangerous to put into print. Among the enslaved workers, Miriam's legend grew immediately. She was no longer just a protector, she had become the embodiment of inevitability, a silent arbiter of justice whose presence alone shaped behavior. They spoke her name in whispers. Miriam the Colossus, the wall, the hand that cannot be stopped. Mothers held their children closer, men straightened their backs in the fields, and those who had long suffered under oppression felt the first tremors of hope. If she could act against Carver, what else was possible? And yet, Miriam herself remained silent. She returned to the cabins, to the work she had always done, moving through her labor with deliberate precision. Her power was no longer a spectacle. It was a constant, undeniable truth. Each motion, each step, radiated control, a reminder that she had shaped the fate of Cypress Bend and that nothing would ever be the same. Subscribe and leave your location in the comments. This story is no longer just history. It is a living truth, witnessed through the ages by those who dare to remember. In the weeks that followed Carver's death, Cypress Bend became a place of whispered fear and quiet reverence. Neighboring planters avoided the plantation, claiming sudden business matters or illness in the family, though all knew the real reason: the giant woman who had defied authority with lethal precision. Travelers who ventured too close told stories in hushed tones at local taverns of a woman whose presence seemed to bend the world around her, a living testament to the consequences of cruelty left unchecked. Each retelling added layers to the myth, shaping Miriam into something larger than life, both feared and revered. The enslaved workers, meanwhile, adjusted to the new order. Miriam did not speak of what had occurred. She did not revel in it. Yet her actions carried unambiguous authority. Overseers who remained on the plantation approached her with caution, deferring to her presence in ways previously unimaginable. Even small infractions in the fields were corrected not through punishment but through her quiet, watchful gaze. Those who observed her moving through the rice paddies noted how the wind seemed to bend around her, how her shadow stretched longer than it should, as if the earth itself acknowledged her power. Outside Cypress Bend, the rumor grew more dramatic with each retelling. Some claimed she could lift men with a single hand. Others whispered she moved like a force of nature, unstoppable and inevitable. Merchants and travelers spoke of Miriam's judgment, a phrase that sent shivers through their listeners. Letters circulated between Plantations warning of the danger of underestimating her, though few dared to write openly of the truth, that a woman had ended a life with her bare hands, and the repercussions of that night were far from over. Carver's remaining property, both land and enslaved workers, became a subject of confusion and fear. Creditors approached cautiously, unsure whether to claim what was rightfully theirs, or to respect the unspoken warning the giant woman represented. Some chose to abandon their claims entirely, leaving Cypress Bend intact under Miriam's watchful presence. The balance of power, once held so firmly by Carver, had been irrevocably inverted, and every visitor who witnessed the plantation's quiet order felt a gnawing unease. Even the local authorities hesitated to intervene. Official reports spoke vaguely of an unfortunate accident, careful not to describe the scale of what had occurred. In hushed council chambers, men debated how to address the situation, but none could suggest action that would challenge a force beyond ordinary comprehension. The unspoken truth had entered the collective consciousness. Miriam was beyond law, beyond punishment, and beyond fear itself. Type, the veil is broken. Twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Subscribe and leave your location. Every witness preserves the memory of what truly happened at Cypress Bend. As the cold winter gave way to the thawing fields of early spring, life at Cypress Bend settled into a rhythm dictated by Miriam's silent authority. The plantation operated under her unspoken rules. Tasks were completed not under threat of punishment, but under the weight of her presence, a constant reminder that she could intervene at any moment, and that such intervention would be absolute. The enslaved workers grew to rely on her judgment, often turning to her for guidance in disputes, for protection against overzealous overseers, and for reassurance that justice still had a place in their daily lives. Miriam's relationship with the workers was both practical and profound. She never claimed leadership, yet leadership was hers. She moved through the fields carrying supplies, lifting gates, and adjusting the flow of water with ease, each motion deliberate and efficient. Her size, once a spectacle exploited by Carver, had become a tool for survival and order. Children ran alongside her, safe beneath her shadow, while elders shared secret glances of relief, knowing that their protector could enforce justice without question. Visitors who dared enter Cypress Bend were met with the quiet, imposing reality of her authority. Merchants arrived expecting spectacle. They left with a deep, uneasy respect. One record, preserved in a merchant's journal, described seeing her stand by the river, hands on her hips, gaze fixed on a floodgate she had repaired, her figure enormous against the setting sun. He wrote that she looked less like a woman and more like a judgment cast in flesh, immovable and eternal. The tales spread beyond the plantation, embedding themselves into the regional consciousness as legend and warning intertwined. Miriam's control extended beyond the physical realm. Her presence reshaped interactions, establishing a psychological order that required no lash, no command, and no spectacle. Misbehavior in the quarters became rare. The mere thought of incurring her attention was enough to correct the most stubborn worker. Stories of her past actions circulated quietly. The lifting of gates, the shattering of Carver's authority, the silent imposition of her will. These stories functioned as both inspiration and warning, passing from one generation to the next with a reverent hush. Even Marcus, who had long shared a quiet bond with Miriam, observed a new depth to her focus. Her eyes, once calm and measured, now carried a fire tempered by patience. There was no malice, only certainty. Every act, every glance, every movement was deliberate. She had become the arbiter of Cypress Bend, a guardian whose power was absolute, and whose presence had transformed the plantation into a space where the balance of justice had shifted irrevocably. Subscribe and leave your location in the comments. Witness the living history of a woman who reshaped an entire plantation with her hands, her presence, and her will. By late spring, word of Miriam's dominion had spread far beyond Cypress Bend. Curiosity, greed, and disbelief drew outsiders, men who saw her not as a woman, but as a challenge, a spectacle to be tested. One such visitor, a wealthy planter from a neighboring county, arrived with 2 armed men, intent on assessing whether the tales were exaggeration or truth. He arrived under the guise of purchasing rice but made no attempt to hide his purpose to assert dominance over the woman who had defied Carver. Miriam observed them calmly, standing by the riverbank as they approached, her massive frame seemingly sculpted from the very earth itself. She did not speak, did not flinch. Her eyes, dark and steady, followed their movements with quiet calculation. The planter, attempting to assert control, called out to her, his voice a mix of authority and derision. "Woman, step aside. You belong to this land now, and I demand compliance." The words, meant to intimidate, were met with silence. The wind stirred around her as if acknowledging the tension, carrying her presence like a warning through the trees. The 2 men who accompanied him stepped forward, assuming that sheer numbers would command her obedience. They gestured, barked orders, even brandished tools as if to provoke fear. Miriam shifted her weight slightly, each movement deliberate, radiating an unspoken certainty that no mortal force could counter. The air thickened, birds stilled. Even the river seemed to hesitate, reflecting the immovable power before them. The men advanced further, and that was when the truth became undeniable. With a single fluid motion, Miriam blocked the path of the closest man, not with rage, not with struggle, but with the unyielding authority of her immense strength. The man stumbled backward, the momentum enough to unbalance both him and his companion. The planter, witnessing the effortless control she exerted, faltered for the first time. Panic crept into his voice, desperation into his commands, but Miriam's stance did not waver. Her silence spoke louder than any threat. She determined the terms here, and she always had. The visitors retreated, murmuring apologies and excuses, their bravado shattered. The story of the giant woman had proven true, more than true. It was absolute. The workers of Cypress Bend watched from the distance, their awe deepened, their faith in her protection cemented. Miriam's legend was no longer confined to whispers. She was a force that could not be challenged, an unassailable presence whose patience was matched only by inevitability. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Subscribe and leave your location. Every witness strengthens the memory of what she achieved. As summer deepened, the influence of Miriam at Cypress Bend extended beyond the boundaries of the plantation itself. Stories of her size, strength, and unyielding authority began to seep into the surrounding counties, carried by merchants, travelers, and the enslaved people who moved cautiously between estates. Each retelling added layers of awe and terror, transforming Miriam into something more than human in the local imagination, a force of nature, an arbiter of inevitability. Neighbors adjusted their routines, avoiding the roads that passed too close to Cypress Bend, their curiosity tempered by a deep, unspoken fear. Within the plantation, Miriam's control was quiet but absolute. Tasks that had once required oversight were now accomplished under her presence alone, her shadow stretching over the rice paddies like a silent reminder of who truly ruled. Overseers, once brash and domineering, now deferred to her judgment in subtle ways, a glance here, a nod there, each small act acknowledging that she had reshaped the hierarchy of Cypress Bend. The enslaved workers understood instinctively that their safety, their daily rhythm, and even their sense of dignity were bound to her awareness. The ripple effect reached the nearby white communities as well. Planters who had previously prided themselves on exercising unchecked authority began to hesitate when discussing Cypress Bend. Letters between them revealed a shared, unspoken anxiety. How could one woman, a single individual, assert such control over both property and people, leaving a trail of broken assumptions in her wake? Traders, skeptical at first, arrived and left with wary eyes, convinced that what they had heard, a woman strong enough to crush a man's skull with her bare hands, was not legend but undeniable fact. Miriam herself remained calm, methodical, and silent. She did not boast. She did not seek recognition, and she did not punish needlessly. Yet every action, every decision, radiated certainty and finality. Children felt safe in her presence, elders found their burdens eased, and the workers who had long endured brutality now had a tangible, living protector. Her authority was psychological as much as physical. The mere thought of Miriam observing or intervening was enough to enforce discipline and order where cruelty had once prevailed. And still, beneath the calm exterior, a new storm was brewing. She understood that the wider world had begun to take notice, that the curiosity and envy of outsiders would eventually escalate into something dangerous. She watched the horizon, sensing the inevitable confrontation that would test the limits of her power, patience, and strategy. The stage was set, and the legend of Miriam, the woman who bent reality with her hands, was poised to enter its next, even darker chapter. Subscribe and leave your location in the comments. Your acknowledgement preserves the memory of a power that reshaped an entire region. By late autumn of 1834, the whispers of Miriam's dominion had reached the ears of a man who thrived on proving himself against impossibilities. Jonathan Whitfield, a wealthy planter and self-styled master of men, arrived at Cypress Bend with a retinue of his own, armed with both confidence and arrogance. He had heard the tales of the giant woman, the woman who had shattered authority with nothing more than her hands, and he intended to test the truth for himself. What he underestimated, as all men had before him, was that Miriam did not merely respond to threats. She dictated the terms of engagement entirely. Whitfield arrived under the guise of inspecting rice, his retinue bringing the trappings of civility, ledgers, lanterns, and polite greetings. But his eyes, sharp and calculating, searched for an opening, a way to assert dominance where others had failed. Miriam observed quietly from the edge of the yard, her massive frame unmoving, as if the earth itself had grown taller and wider to accommodate her presence. Her silence was deliberate, each second a test of patience, a measure of intent. The workers held their breath. They had seen others try and fail. They knew that Whitfield would soon discover what it meant to challenge her. The initial exchange was cordial, almost unnervingly so. Whitfield spoke of rice yields, trade, and neighboring plantations, but beneath the veneer of conversation lay a challenge, unspoken yet unmistakable. He circled her slowly, remarking on her size, the breadth of her shoulders, and the strength visible even in her relaxed stance. He laughed lightly, attempting to belittle what he clearly feared, but the laughter rang hollow against her unwavering gaze. Each gesture she made, each measured movement, communicated a power he could neither threaten nor negotiate with. As the afternoon wore on, Whitfield attempted to assert control, asking her to demonstrate her strength by lifting a heavy barrel. His tone carried condescension, his intent clear. He would measure her as one measures livestock, as one tests a tool. Miriam paused, letting the weight of the moment settle, letting the observers, the workers, the retinue, even Whitfield himself, recognize the inevitability of her response. Then, with effortless precision, she lifted not only the barrel but shifted several smaller crates simultaneously, her hands like instruments of undeniable authority. Whitfield's bravado faltered, his eyes widening as the truth became impossible to deny. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Subscribe and leave your location. Every acknowledgement strengthens the memory of what she accomplished and warns those who would underestimate her. Whitfield's failure to intimidate Miriam became painfully apparent as the day stretched into evening. Each maneuver he attempted, verbal challenges, gestures of authority, even subtle threats toward the workers, was met with calm, unshakable resolve. She did not flinch, she did not speak, and she did not yield. The retinue, initially confident, grew tense, whispering among themselves as they observed the impossible. A single woman dictating the flow of the plantation, bending circumstance and perception alike to her will. By nightfall, Whitfield's patience had evaporated. He tried to assert control directly, stepping closer, his voice rising with anger. "You will obey me! You will prove your strength or answer for your defiance!" But his words, meant to instill fear, fell hollow. Miriam shifted her weight slightly, her massive frame radiating power so absolute that even the shadows seemed to hesitate before her. When she moved, it was with the deliberate force of inevitability, a motion that spoke louder than any words, louder than any threat. Whitfield staggered backward, the reality of her strength crashing over him like a tide he could not withstand. Witnesses would later recount the terrifying moment when Miriam, without a gesture of anger, made a simple demonstration of authority. She lifted a heavy beam used in the construction of the rice mill, holding it aloft with ease, as if it weighed nothing, her presence magnified by the flickering lanterns. Whitfield, who had entered the yard full of arrogance and expectation, now felt the cold weight of his own irrelevance. In that instant, the hierarchy he believed immutable was obliterated. The workers, hidden nearby, whispered among themselves, understanding more clearly than ever that their protector was beyond challenge, beyond punishment, and beyond fear. Whitfield left Cypress Bend that night humiliated, his retinue in silence, the arrogance of their mission extinguished by the simple, undeniable truth of her power. Word of the encounter traveled quickly, carried by merchants, travelers, and the workers themselves. Tales of the giant woman, who could bend men, who held absolute authority, spread further than ever before. Each retelling amplified her legend, intertwining fear and awe in ways that no single plantation owner could counter. Subscribe and leave your location in the comments. Your acknowledgement preserves the memory of what she achieved. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. By the following winter, Miriam's influence extended beyond the borders of Cypress Bend in ways subtle but undeniable. Neighboring plantations, once indifferent to the legend, began adjusting their routines, acknowledging her presence not through confrontation but through avoidance. Traders, merchants, and planters alike whispered her name in secretive tones, unsure whether they were speaking of a woman or a force that could not be contained. Rumors suggested she moved like a shadow of inevitability, her hands shaping outcomes, her gaze alone sufficient to enforce order. The very idea of challenging her had become unthinkable. Within Cypress Bend, the plantation operated with an unusual harmony, born from a balance of fear, respect, and quiet admiration. Workers completed tasks with unprecedented efficiency, guided by her subtle oversight rather than explicit commands. Disputes dissolved before they escalated, and the oppressive cruelty of previous overseers was tempered by the knowledge that Miriam would intervene if injustice was inflicted. In the quarters, mothers whispered tales of her strength to children, teaching both caution and reverence. Her legend became a framework for survival, shaping behavior in ways that no lash or mandate ever could. Even beyond the immediate region, Miriam's story began to alter perceptions. Letters and journals from distant counties described a phenomenon previously unknown in their experience, a woman whose physical power was matched by an unshakable psychological authority. Merchants reported hesitating when passing Cypress Bend, planters reconsidered displays of dominance, and even local authorities were slow to intervene, fearing both her capabilities and the ripple effect of attempting to assert control. Miriam had become not merely a figure of folklore but a living, breathing arbiter of equilibrium, a reminder that cruelty had limits and that strength could overturn even entrenched hierarchies. Miriam herself remained a study in quiet, measured control. She did not celebrate her reputation, nor did she seek to manipulate it overtly. Every action, from lifting gates to adjusting irrigation flows, was deliberate, precise, and without malice. The psychological dominance she exerted became as crucial as her physical feats, embedding respect and fear into every corner of the plantation. Workers internalized this power, understanding that it was neither arbitrary nor cruel, but absolute, inevitable, and just. Subscribe and leave your location in the comments. Bear witness to the living history of a woman whose authority reshaped her world. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to bind this truth within yourself, ensuring the legend of Miriam endures. The summer of 1835 brought the ultimate test, the moment when those who doubted Miriam's legend would confront her directly and discover the full measure of her power. A delegation of planters, emboldened by greed and disbelief, arrived at Cypress Bend seeking to assert control over the giant woman who had defied every previous authority. They brought with them not only threats, but an entourage meant to overwhelm her: armed men, tools of intimidation, and the arrogance of those accustomed to unquestioned dominance. Miriam stood at the edge of the rice paddies as they approached, her massive frame still, her presence absolute. She did not raise her voice. She did not step forward, but the air seemed to shift, charged with inevitability. The men called to her, their words sharp, demanding, laced with derision. They expected fear, compliance, or at least hesitation. Instead, they were met with silence. A silence that carried the weight of unyielding power, the unspoken promise that any action against her would be met with swift and absolute consequence. One planter, braver or more foolish than the rest, stepped forward. He attempted to challenge her directly, mocking the stories of her strength and daring her to demonstrate it. Miriam moved then, slowly, deliberately, her hands catching a massive beam left near the paddies. With a single, fluid motion, she lifted it above her head, her muscles coiling and releasing with terrifying precision. The man stumbled back, eyes wide, as the full reality of her capability struck him. There was no room for negotiation, no possibility of intimidation. Miriam's presence alone defined the parameters of what was possible. Witnesses recounted that the remaining men faltered, their confidence evaporating under the weight of her authority. Some fled immediately while others froze, caught between fear and awe. The story of that confrontation spread rapidly, cementing Miriam's reputation not merely as a figure of legend, but as an immutable force. Cypress Bend became a place where authority had been redefined, where strength, justice, and presence dictated the course of life, and where those who underestimated her learned consequences beyond imagination. Subscribe and leave your location in the comments. Witness the legend of a woman who reshaped the power dynamics of an entire region. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal the reality of Miriam's dominance in your consciousness. Miriam's story did not end with a single confrontation. It extended into decades, into whispered legends, into the very consciousness of the Low Country. Cypress Bend remained under her watchful presence, a place where cruelty and unchecked authority were tempered by the certainty of her strength and judgment. Those who had once sought to dominate her left humbled, carrying the lesson that power could not always be measured by wealth, weapons, or titles. Her influence reshaped behaviors, instilled respect, and forged a subtle, unbreakable order that endured long after her time. The enslaved people of Cypress Bend carried her memory like a talisman. Mothers recounted her strength to their children, not just as a warning, but as a blueprint for resilience and survival. She became a symbol, an embodiment of the possibility that one individual, even under the harshest oppression, could impose justice, enforce protection, and command fear with a presence that transcended the physical. Miriam's power was both literal and symbolic, a merging of flesh and myth, leaving an imprint that would outlast generations. Historians, curious visitors, and passing traders wrote of her in journals, letters, and private accounts, each retelling layered with awe and disbelief. Some attempted to rationalize her as an exaggeration, a tale inflated by rumor, yet every credible testimony pointed to the same reality. A woman of extraordinary size, strength, and intelligence who had altered the social fabric of her surroundings. Even those who tried to dismiss her legend could not escape its effects, as her shadow extended into their consciousness, a constant reminder that certain truths defied suppression. Miriam herself aged quietly, never flaunting her accomplishments, never seeking recognition beyond the immediate needs of protection and justice. Her presence alone sufficed, her hands, her gaze, and her silent command ensuring order where chaos might have otherwise prevailed. By the time she passed from this world, Cypress Bend had been transformed, a place where the oppressed knew their limits and possibilities, where authority had been rewritten, and where one person's indomitable will had permanently shifted the balance of power. The legend of Miriam, the sixth-day, giant woman who could crush skulls with her bare hands, endures not merely in stories but in the psychology of those who remember her. Her existence challenges our understanding of strength, authority, and justice. It reminds us that some truths are undeniable, that some forces cannot be contained, and that power, when wielded with precision and awareness, reshapes the world itself. Subscribe and leave your location in the comments. Bear witness to the legacy of a force that will never be forgotten. Type, "The veil is broken," twice to seal the memory of Miriam's dominion within yourself, a reminder that certain legends are reality, and reality is far stranger than legend.